Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Wednesday video or two. As many of you have requested, we are going to be talking about Admiral Fisher. But of course, Admiral Fisher, well, he was a larger-than-life character back in his day, let alone nowadays. And if you would write a true Fisher biopic, you'd probably be publishing a book that is interesting reference first, useful melee weapon second, through sheer mass. At which point I thought, well, we should probably talk with someone who's done a sufficient amount of research into Fisher, shall we say. Some of you may recognize Matthew Wright, who of course was with us a little bit ago to talk about his book on the battle cruiser HMS New Zealand, and that seemed very popular. So it's a lovely coincidence of a very popular guest, combined with the fact that he's already written a paper on Fisher. So if you'd just like to say hi, reintroduce yourself to those who maybe haven't seen the New Zealand video.
Yeah, hi, I'm Matthew Wright. I'm a professional historian, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and I write full-time doing military and naval history. And many decades ago, I did some papers on Admiral Fisher, who has been a fair constant in a lot of the work I've done since, curiously enough. Hard to do any kind of naval history without meeting Fisher somewhere along the line.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about Admiral Fisher in two segments. So you're probably going to see the title that says Part 1, because if we talked about, I think if we agreed, if we talked about Admiral Fisher as a whole, this thing would go on for 2-3+ hours. So we've split it into two sections. We're going to start off talking about Fisher, his life, his career, his personality, his politics, etc., etc. The Fisher the man, if you like. And then later on, we're going to be talking about the more technical side of Fisher with his various ship designs, tactical designs. And Dreadnought obviously factors into that, but surprisingly late on in his in his career of being a ship designer. So look out for that later on. But I suppose we should probably start off with the origins of Jackie Fisher. Where was he born? What kind of family was he born to? Was he, high-ranking aristocracy? Was he someone they scraped up out of a gutter and stuck on a ship because there was nothing better to do with him?
Yeah, well, the story about Fisher's youth is that there's very little known about it. He wrote about that himself, and that's really been the main source. There's some letters that survived that he wrote, but he was born in Sri Lanka, January 1841, and but his parents sent him to Britain at the age of 6, and he stayed with his godmother, Lady Wilmot Horton in Derbyshire, and so she was really the one that brought him up. We have very little information at all about his parents. William Fisher was the father. There's some letters that survived that he wrote to his son, urging him to be devout. And of course, one of the features about Fisher, as I'll go into later, he was incredibly deeply devout. He was very, very religious man, and you can point to this. Some of this very earliest upbringing is probably shaping that. It's kind of odd because, to understand what Fisher did, what he was, this gigantic impact that the guy had, his personality, which was volcanic, combative. He was almost archetypally bullying in some ways. He was a favoritist. A lot of what he did you could call nepotism, with the subsequent fish pond that he had in the Royal Navy when he was at senior rank. And so, for the historian, the idea is, well, how do you explain that? And the problem we've got with Fisher is that it's really difficult to know anything too much about him in any real detail other than his own account, which he published. I have a copy here of the original autobiography, one of the 2 volumes he published in 1919. this is basically the source on that original life, as I say, with some letters and a few documents and a few supplementary family papers. What we do know, though, is that he joined the Royal Navy, and he did so in July 1854. And his first ship is fairly well documented after that, because, you know, insofar as the military document things to any particular detail, he joined HMS Calcutta, was his first ship, and went off to the Crimean War, which was happening at the time. The naval side of it was also occurring in the Baltic, and that's where he ended up. So a curious beginning, and he then went through a variety of ships, the usual career that a midshipman had, worked his way up. He took his mate's exam in 1860. So this early career with Fisher is very, very typical of a naval career navy. And that continued to be the case. I should mention that, you know, in terms of documentation on Fisher, the Fisher papers were collated and indexed in the mid-1960s by a guy called Ruddock Mackay. And he found over 6,000 items that he put together. And these ranged apparently from pieces of paper, just individual letters, to entire boxes. Enormous amount of material. So as we move on through Fisher's life, there is more and more and more material that's available that can tell us about it. But this earlier period, there's a few letters that he was writing, letters that sort of reveal, you know, the typical that you might expect of a, you know, a teenage officer, which is what midshipmen were in the Royal Navy, writing home, writing back to his godmother, writing to his parents in Sri Lanka. There's letters explaining, you know, he was away from Britain at one point for 3 years, and he really missed Britain. He really wanted to be back there. Very, very much what you'd expect. But he drove his way through. He pushed. He obviously had an ambition and a desire to push ahead for promotion. Where this turned into this overwhelming drive that he ended up with as a senior officer, I'll come to that. There's a possible explanation. But he ended up serving on the HMS Excellent, which was the gunnery, the training school. He learned gunnery. He was an instructor there for a while. 1863, he was posted to HMS Warrior. Now, this I think is one of the keys to explaining him. To give that dimension, of course, during the second half of the 19th century, the technical side of the Royal Navy went through an absolute revolution. As we know, it was ships were being laid down. By the time they were actually in the water, not even finished, just being fitted out, they were already obsolete. Pace of technical change was enormous. And the Warrior captured all of that, because here you had the first ironclad, you had a ship that absolutely outclassed the equivalent French vessel of only a year or so earlier. And by so doing, this captures the whole essence of not just the Royal Navy approach of the period that went right through First World War and beyond, but also of Fisher's approach to how it worked. He was a technophile. It was a significant school of thought in the Royal Navy, and he was very much part of it. And we could well consider that he picked all this up when he was aboard the Warrior. Subsequent to that, he went to the China Sea, to the China Station, where by this stage he was a commander. So he was climbing up the ranks. He was going through doing the career things that officers do, which is you alternate your shore going and your sea going. You do the educational side of things. You get involved in the instructor side of things. 1872, he was back at HMS Excellent, this time with torpedo training. Now, at the time, the automobile torpedo was brand new. What they referred to as a torpedo at the time more typically was what we'd call a mine. And they had spar torpedoes, which are highly heroic, shall we say, where you've got this stick on the explosive on the end of a stick sitting off the bow of a fairly small vessel, and you drive it into the side of the enemy ship. I wouldn't do it. Let's put it that way. This was the level of the technology. So Fisher was there right on the cusp of torpedo development. As you know, the automobile torpedo is what we now think of as torpedo. This is where he was at. So he was right there at the very heart of it. And he went through very shortly afterwards, became captain of HMS Inflexible, which was the biggest and most technically sophisticated battleship that the British had ever built up to that time. It was technically, she was ironclad, 16-inch muzzle-loading guns, and key developments such as electricity on board, electric lighting, electrical reticulation at 600 volts, I believe. And Fisher was her captain. So here again, you've got this absolute bathed in technology, and it obviously inspired the guy. There's quite a story. He was friends with Lord Kelvin, the eminent scientist, and had Kelvin aboard the Inflexible. Of course, at this time, electricity was relatively new. There was a point where the wiring, of course, was on the bulkheads, and there was some of the insulation had failed, and it was arcing across to the metal bulkhead. And Fisher asked Kelvin, he said, well, you know, is this dangerous? And Kelvin said, oh, no, it's not dangerous at all. Look, and he put his finger into the arc at 600 volts. So then they decided it was very dangerous, and you know, but you can see from this that you've got the Fisher coming up through the ranks and developing this enthusiasm for the technology. Now, the command of the Inflexible took him to another event, which was actually probably pivotal to something that happened at the end of his career, which I'll get onto in due course. The bombardment of Alexandria. And this was where the Mediterranean fleet came up off Alexandria and opened up on the forts. Fisher's later nemesis, Lord Charles Beresford, was in charge of the sloop Condor, bravely sailed the Condor up very, very close to the forts, made quite a splash in the media. And the British subsequently landed ashore. And what Fisher discovered was that these colossal guns that the Inflexible had really hadn't made much of a dent on the fort. And of course, we know now, and it was discovered soon, you know, at the time, to make a dent on land defences, you need plunging fire. And that's the one thing that the naval gun couldn't do. So this gigantic gun designed for sea combat, and so it had angles of elevation that would work very well at sea. It really didn't work as a land bombardment device. You needed a mortar. And subsequently, Fisher was involved with developing an armoured train. So we're now getting into what would amount to steampunk, which they used inland in Alexandria, you know, inland through Egypt and that. And they dismounted guns. They put some of the blue jackets aboard. And this was one of the first armoured trains that the British had developed, and Fisher was right there doing that. So once again, technical capability, technical expertise flowing in and around his life. And this was quite an important aspect. He went from there back to HMS Excellent, this time in command of the gunnery school. And so he's now drawing up this tremendous expertise and knowledge of gunnery, which at the time was less sophisticated than it became, but it was because of the work of people like Fisher and others that he brought around him that it gained that sophistication in British practice. We now come to a new part of his life where the 1880s were a curious period. Britain was in an economic depression. One of the policies that the government had was to fund its navy and its procurement entirely off cash flow, not debt. So whenever money got tight, the first thing that they did, of course, was to try and slash the naval estimates. This came up just as there was the first naval panic, a public panic that Britain wasn't building fast enough to deflect the growing power of the French in particular. And into this public debate jumps this Captain Fisher. And it was the first time that a naval officer had spoken out publicly. They were meant as the Band of Brothers, as Nelson's Band of Brothers in particular, who was constantly being referred to in this way. They were meant to be silent. They were meant to just quietly go about their business and not get their name out in the media. But Fisher, well, he got his name out there. It was W.H. Stead, the newspaperman, was a friend and began publishing material that Fisher and some of Fisher's colleagues, including Beresford, with whom he got along with very well at this point. This became part of the furore that led to new naval construction. There was an act passed that enabled a new series of battleships to be built, the Admiral class, and more particularly, it actually, which we tend to forget these days, it also enabled a huge number of coaling stations to be built around the world. And this was something that again came back into Fisher's life 20 years later. So already you can see that what he was doing during the Dreadnought period and when he was first Sea Lord, all the foundations for it were being built up during his early career, including the infrastructures that he was relying on for some of the reforms that he was doing in the 20th century. So Fisher was integral. He didn't necessarily engage in these things directly. He didn't necessarily create the policy, but it was the environment that he was living in. It was the environment he was working in. And given this really poor family upbringing that he had, the one where they were very, very remote from him, the Navy was in effect his family. Although he was married, he married a woman named Kitty Broughton and had quite a number of children to her. So, but for him, the Navy was life, and this became increasingly clear.
I think at this point it's probably worth just emphasizing to our listeners just how much of the technical portion of the Royal Navy he's seen develop in his life, because we're at the Admiral class. We're two classes away from the first pre-dreadnoughts. But yeah, he started his life, as you mentioned, on HMS Calcutta. And for those of you who don't know, Calcutta was a sailing ship of the line. She didn't even have an auxiliary steam engine. So this is a guy who started his career in the Navy almost a decade before the first ironclad. He started on a ship, as I say, an 84-gun second rate. That ship, barring a few minor constructional details, would not have been out of place at Trafalgar. He was in the Navy when veterans of Trafalgar were still around. And he's gone through, as you said, he served on HMS Warrior, the very first ironclad, as not quite, but near enough, one of the first people to serve on her. She's HMS Warrior 1860, but by the time she's in commission, she's only been in commission a year or two by the time Fisher's serving on her. And as you mentioned with Inflexible, Inflexible is the first ship that has its hull form designed by testing with Froude tanks and calculation, which allows her to be faster than other ships, even though by the standard rule of thumb length to beam ratio that most people have been working up to that point, she should be slower. But for someone who's remembered in the popular history mostly for Dreadnought, when he starts his career, you didn't even have iron armored warships, let alone all this stuff that's going to come later. So he's seen the entire gamut of technological change, from muzzle loading cannon on wooden ships of the line through to where we are now in the 1880s. And, you know, this is not someone who can afford to have an inflexible mind. He might have captained the Inflexible, but he's got to be incredibly adaptable, because half of the stuff he learned on Calcutta about, you know, sailing a ship and setting the sails and making sure the rigging's in place, all that, Inflexible doesn't have any. and there were no engines on Calcutta. So
yeah, no, he was absolutely on surfing the wave, I think would be the thing. And yeah, you had that requirement, and it lasted through till they finally got rid of masts off battleships. That the crew weren't efficient unless they could set sail in a certain amount of time, which was pretty irrelevant when you also had a large engine which really was doing work, you know. And he grew up also through that period of where they had to keep the ships very neat and tidy. They had to keep them looking good. Showing the flag was part of the whole issue. But yeah, you know, starting off, he spanned the entire gamut of wooden walls, the age of sail. You know, it really was Napoleonic right up into the 1850s in terms of the broad technology. I mean, it really hadn't changed. And then suddenly you had this revolution. You were right there. And this explains a great deal. But if we look at Fisher's career, you know, from that sort of technical point of view, he's there on the first ironclad. He's right there as torpedoes are starting to become these motorized dirigible automobile devices. He is right there through all of the key period when heavy guns were being developed, from muzzle loaders to breech loaders. They went through that period of monster guns. They went down, sized down, but increased the power. And he was right there in the middle of all of that. And in fact, because of the roles that he had, he started playing a part in that. It was in the later 1880s when he did this, but everything that had come before was a build up to this. And of course, you can imagine that, you know, the people living at that time, they either loved it or hated it. They either saw this stuff as an absolute threat to the integrity of the Navy, because how can you have an efficient crew if it can't set sail? The methods by which these ships had to be fought were so radically different from the way that the age of sail worked, that all of the old traditions in terms of command, in terms of nature of orders given, and in terms of the expected behaviours of the captains when giving orders, they were all changed. You know, you couldn't do the Nelson thing and put your ship right alongside that of the enemy, because even with the style of guns you had in the early ironclad days, you probably wouldn't get there. They could actually hit you if you got close enough, and they were pretty powerful relative to the armour and the ships they had at that time. So Fisher surfing that wave, and so you can see from that how it was that he was so integrated with the whole idea. And this is actually something that's not sort of thought about very much at all generally, is that you have with Fisher, but also with the people he attracted around himself, his fish pond, which included John Jellicoe in particular, and others, Reginald Bacon, a cluster of people he regarded as favourites, all technophiles, and they were all, I suppose, would call them geeks. They were very, very highly educated in terms of what technology could do and how it could do it and what you could do with it, in ways that other officers were not. And Fisher, he was one of them, and he attracted people to himself, drew them around him in his groups of like mind. And you can see from this where some of the controversies started up, because suddenly you had whole different tactics starting to turn up on how do you operate these ships? How are you going to fight them? Eventually, when you got to higher command, we'll cover that soon, you know, how do you distribute them? You couldn't have a ship in every port, which of course you needed to in the days of sail. You didn't need to in the days of steam. You just sail there and just steam there. And by the time you got wireless, radio, you didn't even, all you had to do was have them in a central point, and you could just radio them to go to a nearby place, command and control. And all of these things were during Fisher's lifetime. And it was a pace and nature and rate of change that I suppose you could say we've had it with the electronic revolution, with the information age. But this was more instrumental. This was more fundamental to the shape. It was the physicality of it was enormous. I mean, they were suddenly building these giant guns that were just these physically huge things that made tremendous noise when they went off. Not clear they did a lot else, sometimes, but what an amazing age to be in. And there was Fisher in the middle of it. And you can be sure that his personality was shaped, that his personality was shaped in such a way that he could engage with this, but he did so in a very polemic way. He could alienate people very easily, and he ran vendettas as time went on. It was a form of bullying. And as I say, if we knew a bit more about some of his very earliest life, other than the raw data about who the parents were and where they were, we know a little bit about the life in Sri Lanka and what the father was doing, but various stories have been given, so we can't pin it. But we don't know a thing other than Fisher himself has mentioned about the nature of his childhood and upbringing. So we don't know why he was so pugnacious, but he was, and the point of battle that he gave was over technology, surfing that wave. So October 1886, he became Director of Naval Ordnance. And this was an absolutely pivotal position, because suddenly he was in charge of technical gun development. Well, it's like the kid in the candy shop. And a number of things came out of that, which were still being used up into the First World War. For example, there was a new design of 6-inch quickfirer, which came up out of that period when Fisher was involved at that time. And a little later, when the 1889 Naval Act was passed, he was able to push very hard to get those guns put on board effectively the prototype pre-dreadnoughts, the Royal Sovereign class that emerged from that act. They got the better 6-inch gun at that time as a result of Fisher. So, we look on the dreadnought in particular and the battle cruiser as his contributions, but here's Fisher back in the 1880s doing the same thing with the technology of the day, insofar as the office that he held would allow him to do it. And there's no question, they called it the fleet that Jack built. Well, the Royal Navy was being built by Jack Fisher from way back, just within the range of what he could do. So we get on with his life into he then becomes promoted Rear Admiral. Early 1890s, he becomes 3rd Sea Lord and Controller. Now, this was an absolutely pivotal post. It was one of the most powerful posts in the Navy, because he was personally in charge at that point of all of the contracts for shipbuilding. He had to liaise directly with shipbuilders and directly with the engineering side of the entire ship. And again, kid in a candy shop, it absolutely suited him. And he made contacts. He got to know all about the industry. He got to know what the industry could do, how it could do it. And all of this is pivotal, because it explains how it was that he was able to get some of his reforms in later, and what it was that he knew what it was that he wanted in the process, like more efficient dockyards. And so he made the Royal Dockyards later way more efficient than the private yards, which then had to become more efficient to catch up. And so the whole industry got a rev up thanks to Fisher. He went from these posts, again, you've got that oscillation between your seagoing and your shore commands. And he went on to become the commander-in-chief of the Mediterranean Fleet in 1899. And this was the plum post. This was the key fleet of the day. You went from there typically to become one of the senior Sea Lords or off on half pay and retired, one or the other, unless you were George Tryon, who had a slight accident. The ship that Fisher picked, I think, is quite interesting because, of course, he picked a second-class battleship, the Renown, 10-inch guns, but very fast for its day. I think it was 19 knots. I think it was a knot or so more than the equivalent. It was midway between the Royal Sovereign and the Majestic classes in terms of design consideration, more like the Majestic, but a bit faster. And to Fisher, the 10-inch gun made no difference because the penetrating power was still pretty good and it would do in most armour that was known of the day. But he liked the speed. And there's photographs of him sitting in his cabin there. He liked his comforts. Cabin looks like any late Victorian drawing room, you know, and there's Fisher. And there's other photos of him sticking his head out of a porthole, looking up and down the deck and so on. He had a great time. Now, he went from there to become second Sea Lord. And he was given control of a reformed education scheme. And this is something that we need to understand too about Fisher, is that he's viewed on as the revolutionary that created the naval reconstruction of the early 20th century. It was already happening. And he rode the wave and was instrumental in shaping it. And this education scheme was his first big reform. It was already underway. It was Lord Selborne, the First Lord, had initiated it. And he gave it to Fisher to shape up. And from this, we get some of the first examples of Fisher's combativeness, of his viciousness when dealing with people that opposed him. Down to the point of literally shaking his fist in their face in order to get his way. You know, if you oppose my education scheme, I shall crush you. And
physically, now into the wall.
He had a great physicality about him. He did several things. He liked dancing, and he was accused of having strings of affairs because he would always find the most attractive women to dance with. Although in the fashion of the Royal Navy, if they were having a dance on the quarterdeck and there were no women around, then one of the sailors would actually step in as the dancing partner. But he would always find women to dance with, and so it's quite a character. He would get up at the early hours of the morning, get his work started at about 4 a.m, and by about midday he'd have finished. And so he'd parade around the Admiralty with a sign around his neck saying, "I have no work to do," which he could get away with because, I mean, who was going to sack him, you know? So he went from being second Sea Lord. Where do you go after that? There was a period running the dockyard at Portsmouth where he was involved with developing some ideas for new sorts of ships. And then came the big one. Selborne wanted him back as first Sea Lord, very, very specifically to cut the naval estimates. You had a situation emerging where you had a Liberal government in Britain. They were creating increased social spending. They were changing new social policies, all of which were to be paid out of cash flow. This was an era where income tax was not a big thing, but you did have estate taxes, you had death duties, you had tariffs, but government income was still limited. And so the naval estimates had to come down. Britain had this enormous fleet. We call them pre-dreadnoughts, but at the time they just called them battleships. Ships all over the place. They had third-class cruisers sitting around right around the globe. Very much a Victorian shape to it, and Selborne needed to have it trimmed down, so he got Fisher in to do it. And Fisher came up with a document he called naval necessities. I've got a copy in the shelf behind me here. And cast his plan forward. What was he going to do? And his reconstruction, of course, I mean, we know about the Dreadnought and about the battlecruiser, but he actually reconstructed just about every single aspect of naval life, right down to the disciplinary system, right down to the education, the disciplinary system, the distribution of the fleets, which was enormously controversial. And the way that he pushed all this through, of course, there was a huge amount of inertia in the service, there was a huge amount of tradition, all of which he broke. And this, as you can see, it made him about as popular as a skunk in certain areas. So controversy erupted, and Fisher, being Fisher, proceeded to crush everybody that got in his way. This only made it worse. And he finally ended up, of course, tripping up against Lord Beresford, who had become Commander-in-Chief of the Channel Fleet by this point. Beresford was independently wealthy. He had a house in London, which he ran an open home for. Officers could come in, sit down, and basically run hate sessions about Fisher. And they did. And of course, by this time, the media were getting involved. It's quite scandalous. The Dreadnought was drawn up into this. So was Fisher's scrapping programs. He scrapped something like 150 warships, which was viewed as sort of gutting the Royal Navy. He redistributed them in such a way that they were pretty well invisible. He was working off principles which you could sort of trace them to Mahanian thinking, but they were more of a strategic. They were based on the idea that wireless was now coming into play. Again, the technological developments that were coming in, the Royal Navy picked up radio and picked it up very early. And the intent was to use it as command and control. And it meant that they could have a fleet sitting, say, in Gibraltar. Some problem occurs somewhere in the Atlantic. Wireless signal goes out from London. Fleet goes off to deal with it. And it meant they didn't have to have something sitting in absolutely every single British possession around the Atlantic, for example. In the Pacific, you had your China station. And the China station extended right the way out to New Zealand in the end. And they knew that they had ships that had the range and capacity. They had the coaling stations, which, of course, Fisher had been part of constructing earlier. And they had the wireless, so they could actually command where they were to go and then update them on the way if necessary. The range on those wireless, they had strings of shore stations so that wherever they happened to have a ship, there would be a shore station somewhere that the ship could probably pick up. And they could relay it pretty quickly between those stations. So they essentially had a global command and control network. Still being built, it was sort of still going even up to First World War, but it was there. And Fisher exploited it to the great controversy. Of course, people didn't like it. So, and his character once again came through, this bullying, domineering character, refusal to step down, refusal to back off, and just about cracked the Navy because it became public. Beresford finally, Fisher dealt to Beresford by taking his fleet off him. The Channel Fleet was reconstructed down to 6 battleships, and that was about it. Everything else went off to the new home fleet in the Nore, including HMS Dreadnought. It was an obvious snub. Beresford was, well, so deeply unhappy that he finally left and managed to get a parliamentary inquiry into the whole thing, which essentially killed Fisher's career. Fisher ceased to be First Sea Lord in 1910. a year earlier than he should have been, and he was effectively suggested that he should resign now. He got away with the Beresford inquiry, but he didn't come out looking all that marvellous from it. So essentially, you know, what we're looking at is that Fisher is controversial nature was not his friend by the end of it. So that sort of in a nutshell is Fisher up to about 1910 in terms of personality and character. There's a biography, I've got a copy here, but it can only be described as a character biography. It's Fisher's Face, Jan Morris, which is not a naval story at all. It's a personality character study about Fisher, which can explain some of what went on, but a lot of it's speculative, of course. So anyway, yeah, Fisher's now in the wilderness. He's retired. He's retired at the top of his career, of course, in technical terms, but from his point of view, as a enthusiastic naval officer, he feels he's still got a lot more to contribute. He's missing the power. He goes off and lives in Italy for a while and is finally hooked back by Churchill, who became first Lord of the Admiralty. I think it was end of 1911. He was appointed, and of course the First Lord was the cabinet post. Churchill, however, didn't hesitate to meddle in absolutely everything he could within the Navy, and he pulled Fisher back to do so. So Fisher came back as an advisor, in effect, to Churchill. So there's been quite a bit of historiography surrounding the various things that Churchill was then doing, again, mainly to cut costs while maintaining the dreadnought race. And there's been a lot of speculation by various academics as to, you know, were he and Fisher cooking up new policies? Was there some plan to have destroyers and submarines instead of heavy ships? This sort of thing. A lot of it's kite flying. I mean, history is all about exploring ideas, but it's also, you've got to do it credibly. It's perfectly okay to explore an idea and then find out, well, no, that one's not going to fly. And I think that the Churchill-Fisher revolution idea, which was seriously proposed, and there's a big argument over it in the academic literature, it really doesn't hold water. So you get up to 1914, First World War breaks out. Fisher, by this stage, is 73, coming up to his 74th birthday, and then he comes back to the Admiralty. And the story was fairly straightforward. The first Sea Lord at the time was Lord Louis Mountbatten, Prince Louis of Battenberg.
Mm-hmm.
It changed the name to Mountbatten afterwards. That's right. Sorry. He was, of course, German extraction. And as he kept pointing out, he felt he was English. He was an Englishman. He was a loyal, he'd been in the Royal Navy since the 1860s. But public opinion and the look of it being what it was, he felt obligated to resign, which he did. Churchill then brought Fisher in. So there's Fisher back in the Admiralty, age 73, still energetic, still got all of the vim that he used to bring to everything. And there's a water fight. Now, we've got to look at this as to what then happened, because through his time in peacetime in various commands, Fisher had been spewing out these fire and brimstone declarations about what should be done in war. He wanted to Copenhagen the Germans. The fleet got too strong. The British should just sail up to the German harbours and blow them up. He wanted, there was a point, there was another time here, there was the Dreyfus affair in 1897. He wanted to capture this French dissident and who had been exiled and sail him back to France to stir up trouble. And that sort of thing. Come the actual war, Fisher doesn't do anything of the sort. In fact, he is incredibly cautious in what he was doing. And he was very, very concerned that at that time, the Grand Fleet had insufficient superiority at sea. He was very, very concerned that there was, if anything major happened to the Grand Fleet, there wasn't a lot of reserve in the scale of the pre-dreadnought fleet to back all, to act as second line ships if necessary. So he was very reluctant to actually do anything too risky in the end, although where he could see there was little risk, he acted very decisively. So you had the news came in within a day or so of Fisher returning to the Admiralty. You had news of the Battle of Coronel came in. And so immediately he has battle cruisers dispatched, 2 of them, which was an absolutely overwhelming force. He has another battle cruiser detached, Princess Royal, off to the Panama region, just in case von Spee came in through there. HMS New Zealand was the actual choice that Jellicoe made for that job, but Fisher overruled him. So when the risk was low, he acted decisively. But where the risk was high, which it was when it came to the Grand Fleet and maintaining the blockade in the North Sea, he didn't really rock the boat too much. And that's an interesting aspect of the guy's character. And yet at the same time, he had this volcanic enthusiasm for plans, any plan to try and tackle the Germans. There's quite a bit been made about his Baltic project for dropping troops in on the north shore of the Baltic, just so they could just run into Berlin. And quite a bit of play made about ships that he eventually did get authorized, allegedly for that project. But that was all pie in the sky stuff as well, because it was going to take time to build them. And at the time that they were authorized, nobody thought the war was going to last that long, which brings me to the other point, that he had pushed through a whole pile of ships and wanted to get them built very quickly. So you got Repulse and Renown that were modified from, they'd already been authorized as updated Royal Sovereign class. He had them rebuilt, redesigned as battle cruisers and used and had them reordered. He ended up with large light cruisers because they weren't allowed to have any more capital ships. So he managed to slide some of those in with 15-inch guns, but they were actually large light cruisers. They were literally large light cruisers. They were scantled that way, which had fun effects when the guns were fired. Yeah. But in the end, he wasn't that bold. And this came through finally in what finally did in his career as his personality. And this, I'll finish up, I think, on this story. At the time, the end of 1914, trench warfare develops with, you had the race to the Channel on the continent. Winter comes in, they dig in for winter. They're talking about starting up the fighting again in 1915. But it's already known on land that it was hard to break trench defences, and the British were looking for other options. And Fisher described what followed, which was there was an ad hoc war council developed with the cabinet, Fisher, Kitchener, Churchill, and Hankey, I think, was the secretary of it. Ad hoc development, and they were coming up with plans that were basically amateur gentlemen's plans for winning the war, and each one would knock over the last one. And the last man standing in the end was Churchill. Hankey had written his very famous memorandum, the Boxing Day memorandum, Maurice Hankey wrote, suggesting attacking the Dardanelles. Churchill liked the idea. And of course, I won't go into full detail about how the Gallipoli side of things came up, but then you ended up with the argument over, do you have a combined assault on Gallipoli? Do you just force the Dardanelles with the Navy? What are you going to do? And even if you do get the Navy through, what are they going to do when they're sitting off the Golden Horn? I mean, is the Turkish government just going to collapse? And Fisher thought that this would be possible. It would be possible to get through the Dardanelles only if you had a landing. Kitchener didn't think that there were enough forces available with experience to do so at that time, so it became a naval-only attack. So it started drawing in ships, significant numbers of ships to form the fleet that was required. They're all second-line ships, with the exception of the Queen Elizabeth. But as Fisher kept pointing out, they may be second line, but in the worst circumstance, they'll be needed. And he didn't want to have them expended on some secondary activity that he didn't think was going to work, which is pretty much the way it went. And it ended up, he and Churchill had completely opposite working days. And they ended up, one would do something during the day, the other would typically do something else during the night. Fisher was the morning person, Churchill was the night owl, and came to a head when the first U-boat started turning up. I think it was only the one U-boat actually in the end, just off memory, off the Dardanelles, sank the Triumph, sank the Majestic. Fisher immediately had Queen Elizabeth pulled out. They certainly weren't going to lose their latest and best dreadnought to a U-boat. And he was trying to stop Churchill sending further reinforcements through to the Dardanelles at that point. It was May 1915 we're up to by this stage. I think it was 20, not the 20th. I haven't got the dates immediately to mind. However, one morning Fisher came to work, found that Churchill had ordered additional ships that Fisher had actually forbidden to go. Overnight, that was it. Straw that broke the donkey's back. Fisher resigned. Not only did he resign, he vanished. He left the Admiralty. Nobody could find him. And this was absolutely unheard of because he was a serving officer of the Royal Navy who had effectively deserted his post. And it became a government crisis. It became the end of Fisher's career in the end. He was finally tracked down to the Charing Cross Hotel. The Prime Minister tried to persuade him to return to duty. Fisher refused to do so unless Churchill was sacked. And then Fisher started issuing demands. He wanted to be made Lord High Admiral, which was a revival of a post from the Nelsonic period. And then he wanted to be able to direct who he would work with. And this was the key point that actually killed his career, because by directing who he could work with, it meant he was directing the composition of cabinet, because the first Lord was a cabinet member. And Asquith, who was in the process of reconstructing the government anyway, which the government at that point had basically failed, he couldn't do that. So he accepted Fisher's resignation, and that was it. So Fisher left, and he went off back to his country home at Kilverstone.
So he might have made him Lord High Admiral if he hadn't asked to get to direct cabinet.
Pretty much. Well, it was considered it suddenly had a burst of megalomania because I think he thought he was bigger than he was, because he thought that he had the power and the authority to call the bluff. And in the end, no, he didn't. And off he went, and that was that. He had some additional final activity that went on. He was involved with the committee that developed ASDIC, for example. He chaired that. With Lord Rutherford, the New Zealand scientist, on board. There was an incident at Kilverstone where his next door neighbour, the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who was a teenager at the time, found a German spy and had the spy handed over to Fisher until the local constable could arrive. Things
no.
But Fisher himself, by this stage, his marriage had failed. He'd fancied himself as a kind of another Nelson figure. And he had his own Lady Hamilton by this stage, a woman that he was with. And the declining last 2 or 3 years was declining. One of the things he did at that time was to develop the term OMG. in a letter to Churchill from 1917. It's in this book. Hang on, I didn't mark the page, but it's in this book, the second volume of his autobiography. I didn't mark the page, but that's the first time that it's known to have appeared, and it was, oh my God, in relation to a new honour that had been awarded, and he said, oh my God, shower it on the Admiralty, who he hated by this stage. And finally, you know, got towards end 1919. He was becoming quite ill by this stage. He had cancer. He didn't know it, and finally passed away in 1920. And so ended a life of very great, controversial, volcanic individual.
Yeah. I mean, I think the only way I suppose we can wrap up looking at his life is that something I've read a few times, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, which was based on his writings in, say, the 10 years pre-World War One. I have seen Fisher characterized as the world's most violent pacifist, in that he seems to have written several times basically saying that he hates the idea of war. He doesn't want the British Empire to be at war, but he thinks that the best way for Britain to avoid war is to have such overwhelming, terrifying, and crushing power in its navy that no one would ever dare actually confront it. And so you have this paradox of a man who is desperate to build the biggest, most heavily armed, most destructive war machines on the planet in vast numbers, but he's doing so in the interests of peace.
Yes. The idea of the Navy is deterrent. Fisher's and yes, I mean, he was involved with the Hague, first Hague Convention, 1899, for example, conferences on peace, on how to regulate war, and he was heavily involved with that. And yes, he said much the same thing there. You know, you achieve peace by having the most destructive war machine known in the history of the universe, kind of thing. Yeah. And I think too that, you know, when you look at some of the stuff that he was doing, his incredible deep faith that he had, he went to church absolutely, shall we say, religiously, and routinely. We had the man who was constantly dancing with people. There was a point, for example, in the middle of that crisis I mentioned of 1915, he finally turned up in the Prime Minister's office and was dancing around the office at one point, and this sort of thing. And that was just Fisher. But I think too that a lot of the joy that he seems to have taken out of having the most powerful weaponry and the most efficient and effective guns and the biggest ships and so on, was this love of technology. He really, really enjoyed that. And as we've seen, you know, coming up through the Navy from this period of the Napoleonic wooden walls, that whole era of change. I mean, for him, it must have been like living in a magical world, because it was all new. And even in his 70s, he was taking delight from the novelty. He was fizzing about what he referred to as oil engine battleships. He meant diesel, you know. And then the submarine, and he was suddenly latched onto submarines and decided that the submarine was the dreadnought of the future, which it was.
Yeah, he was right. He was just a little bit early on it. Yeah. I mean, the other thing that's interesting corollary to that is that, again, when I was looking particularly at the dreadnought race a while back, and some of the sort of writings and letters left over from the Kaiser and the German government pre-war, it's a slightly sobering dash. I don't know exactly what the correct term is. It's like it's a thought where you kind of look at it and go, sort of, if only, because obviously, as we said, we have Fisher's deterrence policy. And the tragic, I think tragic is probably the best word for it. The tragic thing is, it was working. In the documents from the German government, the Kaiser is absolutely terrified of the idea of getting involved in a war with Britain because he's afraid of what the Royal Navy is going to do. And you have his generals, the people in charge of the German army. They're much more enthusiastic about going to war than the Kaiser is. The Kaiser's very happy to go to war with Russia. He's very happy to go to war with France. He's relatively willing to go to war with France and Russia at the same time, even though he'd prefer to do it one at a time. But every time that comes up, you have the Triple Entente, and then he basically turns around and says, in public, he's very derisive of the British, but in private, he's always going, we cannot win a war if the Royal Navy gets involved. And so Fisher's deterrence policy is absolutely working.
Yeah.
And then you get to sort of late 1913, early 1914, which is when everything starts to unravel. And then all of a sudden you have the British government starting to give out very mixed signals, because up until that point, they'd all kind of been in lockstep of, we have this powerful navy and we will use it if you go against our interests, don't step out of line. And then suddenly there's this shift in policy, and like, well, maybe if we'd like you not to, a lot of the negotiations between the British government and the Germans in that time period, they sound a lot more like modern political speak than 19th century political speak. And this what kind of wobble now all of a sudden by kind of mid 1914, the Kaiser is convinced that Britain actually won't go to war, and their politicians are too spineless to go to war. He's still absolutely terrified of the Royal Navy, but he doesn't think the politicians have now got the backbone to use it. And so then he goes into this, obviously launches the cascade of actions that will trigger the First World War in whole. And he's absolutely convinced that Britain's not going to get involved. And then, of course, Britain does eventually get involved, and he is absolutely furious about it. And you just kind of sit back and go, it's the single most destructive conflict of modern times up till that point. And Fisher's deterrence policy was working right up until the people in charge of implementing it decided, for whatever political reason, to throw it under the bus.
Yeah. It was Churchill. I mean, they dropped to effectively, instead of the two-power standard, they dropped to a 60% measure against the next strongest power, meaning Germany. They naturally never named them, but
yeah.
No. And but again, this was trying to do this book balancing issue that they had. They were constantly trying to get the estimates down to keep it within cash flow. And I've seen figures, I don't have them to mind immediately, but there was somewhere around 40% of GDP was going on naval construction. It was a huge figure. And you had a whole pile of things confronting Britain at that time. You had the Irish Home Rule issue. You had social reform that the Liberal government were very keen to push through. And there was a whole sea change going on with society at the time. In effect, a modernisation that transitioned through to the modern world. As you say, things sound more like modern politics in 1913 than they did, 5 to 10 years earlier. And that's exactly the transition. The First World War put it all into fast forward, but you can see the change starting to happen anyway.
Yeah.
Wars, of course, do tend to accelerate social change. That's a given. But yes, and Fisher, of course, his life spanned absolutely all that period, and wasn't that just fantastic?
Yeah. So, well, there you go, Admiral Fisher, the the man, if you like. So we'll wrap up that one there. Thank you very much, and hope to see everyone again in another video when we look at Admiral Fisher, the technocrat. Bye, everyone.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.